Folks, good day. It was Robert Lucas who said, once you think about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And I should admit that that same bug has caught me too, to a certain extent. In my presentation today on growth theory, I'll start with a scholar to which we all are familiar with at this point, and that is Thomas Malthus and what he posited on growth. Right. What Thomas Malthus posited on growth was that economic development that is experienced by a society is directly correlated to population growth. What this means is that when there's economic development or there's a greater level of production in society, it is characterized by an increase in the fertility rates and or decrease in the mortality rates as resources become more available to the society at large. But it comes to a halt once the society reaches again its steady state. Now, once it is at its steady state, the resources per capita are back at their initial period, even though there's a greater level of resources in terms of levels, but in terms of ratios, there is no change in the amount of resources that's available. And if society, for instance, were to be at a point where the population is greater than the amount of resources, what will then happen is that the redundant population will dissipate as a result of there not being enough resources to keep the society at its replacement rate in terms of its population growth. So this was posited by Thomas Malthus. Now, as I move to someone who is a friend of, or who was a friend of Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, who posited on his theories on economic growth in a feudal society. So what David Ricardo posited was that in a feudal society, what tends to happen is that in the initial periods of development of society is that the society first occupies the land and cultivates the land that is the most fertile, and it therefore cultivates land that is less fertile as it develops. So the concept of the Ricardian vice in this framework becomes important because there are simplified assumptions that David Ricardo makes, such as the assumption that he posits that the landlords to which have the least amount of fertile that is being cultivated do not receive rent, right? And another assumption, a simplified assumption that he makes, is that there is the productivity of labor in each given land is equal, so to speak. So these are some of the simplified assumptions that David Ricardo makes in the assertion of his theory on economic development. So as I've said, that in the initial period that the society first cultivates the land that is the most fertile, and once society develops, what therefore tends to happen is that there is more land that is put into cultivation that is least fertile. And as this happens is that the landlords who have the most fertile land accrue profits, and the more land that is cultivated that is not as fertile, the greater is the rent to the landlords. Now, as this happens, there's a decrease in the profits that are accrued by the capitalists who employ their capital and hire their labor in the initial period at higher than subsistence level. Now, them hiring labor and giving them wages at a rate that is higher than subsistence level induces the productivity of, not necessarily the productivity of society, but also the population growth of a given society. Now, as this happens, there's a decrease in the profits accrued to the capitalists, as I've said, and an increase to the landlords who accrue greater profits when the society reaches a steady state where the population cannot grow anymore, because the wages will drop down to a point whereby they can only facilitate for society to replace itself in terms of its population, right? So the concept of finitude becomes paramount in the assertions that are made by Ricardo, and as well as Malthus. And at this point, the economics was viewed as a dismal science because of such assertions that they made. Now, I move on to someone that was very much influenced by David Ricardo, Adam Smith, as well as the other classical writers on economic thought, and that is being none other than Karl Marx. Now, some of the Ricardian vice is also gripping Marx, so to speak, in this aspect, because one of the assumptions that Marx makes in his analysis on the capital accumulation in his book on Das Kapital is that the capitalists invest 100% of their profits to capital accumulation. That is, that the capitalists save all their money and invest in a greater level of capital. Now, the assertions that he makes in his growth theory are that as society develops, so to speak, or in a capitalist mode of production, what tends to happen is that the rate of profit is given by surplus value to constant capital plus variable capital. Now, in order for the capitalists to have an increase in their surplus value, what they can do is that they can increase the exploitation of labor, or they can employ a greater level of constant capital. Or what they can do is that for a given level of constant capital, decrease the amount of variable capital. Now, this means that in terms of the exploitation, it might mean that giving employees lower wages and expecting them to work more and be more productive. But then this concept comes into a point whereby there's limits to it. So what they can also do is that they can hire a greater level of constant capital for them to accrue this surplus value. But the more and more that the capitalists hire a constant capital, and there is a greater level of the industrial reserve army, as what increases the population of the working class is this capitalist mode of production, there will be a greater level of unemployment due to the fact that there will be a less and less variable capital that is being employed. Now, not counting when capital is concentrated into the hands of the few, but there's something that is akin to a perfect competition. What tends to happen is that the more the capitalists employ this constant capital, there is going to be a reduction in the rate of profits. Now, in some sense, in the capitalist mode of production, is that the capitalists kind of kill themselves in a sense by the rate of exploitation and hiring greater and greater levels of constant profits, which reduce their rate, the constant capital, which reduce their rate of profits. So the concept of finitude, even in this regard, still holds. I therefore then now move on to things to the concept of economic growth that is akin to that was made in the 20th century by Robert Solow and co-authors in his seminal paper on economic growth. Now, what Robert Solow posited was that he also, I should mention that there was simplified assumption that he made in his approach to economic growth. One of the assumptions that he makes is that he believes, not necessarily believes, but what he assumes is that there is one homogeneous product that is being produced by each given economy in order for him to build the model that he builds on economic growth. Now, the Solow growth model takes into account basically three variables, I should say: capital, labor, and output, right? and there is two variables that are endogenous. That means that they're explained within the model, but other variables such as labor are explained outside of model. So it's as if that labor is something that comes from outside but is not explained within the model. So what he posits in his economic growth analysis is that capital accumulation only has a temporary effect in regards to the growth rate of an economy in terms of its output. In steady state, what therefore implies is that the accumulation of capital has no effect on the economic growth. It only has an effect in the output levels, but it does not have an effect on terms of the output per growth, right? So now at this point, there was modifications that were made to the model so that it includes exogenously the role of technology in terms of the Harrod neutral or Hicks neutral, where it would be labor augmenting or capital augmenting respectively. Now, once we then get into some of the modification, what would tend to happen is that they would include human capital accumulation to be factored within the model. So they would include education and so forth. Now, at this point, the conclusions that were reached by the model, even with regards to the modifications, was that the level of output per capita in terms of growth is facilitated by technological growth and not by the accumulation of capital. Now, I should also then point out too that the role of population growth is detrimental to economic growth in this model, right? But the fact that the model does not explain technological growth, but it implies that technological growth is what leads to growth, was a problem. So now this is where the models of the 1980s that were posited by Paul Romer, being endogenous growth models with his co-authors, now took into account the technological development into their analysis, right? Now, the role of population growth is therefore turned in on its head from the models that I have aforementioned, because now it turns from a negative into a positive in this model when the role of economic ideas are considered. So when the roles of ideas are considered in the economy, what therefore then tends to happen is that the research and development sector is considered. Now the institutions come into role in regards to the patent laws, so that they can incentivize the research and development within companies and individuals, so that they can engage in research in order to facilitate for technological growth, right? I have already mentioned that technological growth in this regard is highly positively correlated to the population growth, because a population growth implies that there's a greater level of researchers that can be put into the research and development sector, so that they can facilitate for higher technological growth. There's some simplified assumptions that are made that are similar to the solo growth model in terms of capital accumulation and so forth. But now, in the interest of time, I'll just move on to the unified growth theory that was posited by Oded Gallo and his co-authors. Now, they take into the role of fertility rates and the relationship that it has with economic development. And now what they do is that they divide the time era into three epochs, that being pre-Malthusian epoch, where the economic development is characterized by low growth and low fertility rates as well. And then there's the Malthusian epoch, where high growth rates are facilitated by high population growth rates or fertility rates. and then the post-Malthusian epoch, where we see in developed countries whereby there is a greater level of economic development facilitated by a lower level of fertility rates and or low mortality rates. Now, what this therefore implies, or what facilitates the transition of economies from one Malthusian epoch to the next, is technological growth and the role of human capital accumulation. Now, in this regard, it is of importance that I point out that in the paper of Gallo and Mauve 2004, that the role of economic development changed from being one that was facilitated by the accumulation of physical capital to where it's now facilitated by the accumulation of human capital. Now that changes the roles in terms of the participation of individuals in that framework. What therefore that implies is that we see a quantity-quality trade-off that was posited by the Chicago School of Economists Gary Becker, who said that when there are greater level of economic resources and human capital accumulation becomes a factor that is required in society for economic development, what therefore tends to happen is that there is going to be parents having less children and investing a great amount into their education. So now this changes the dynamics from an agrarian society to one to which we now have a society that is facilitated by lower fertility rates. Now these assertions are commensurate with the assertions that were made by Hans Rosling, where he predicts that in the next 100 years or so that the population will top out at about 9 to 10 billion. This is from the fact that there is a greater level of human capital accumulation in given societies, especially that given to women, that will facilitate for lower fertility rates. Now, in all of this, what is of importance is, why is it that we see that there is countries that go through growth disasters such as Argentina or Zimbabwe, and then we see countries that go through growth miracles such as Taiwan and Singapore? The people such as Hall and Jones point to social infrastructure. Now, the role of social infrastructure takes into account the cost-benefit analysis that should be taken into account in terms of the investment into a given economy and or society. So the role of the size of the market, the soundness of the institutions within a given market, in terms of them being productive or they're divertive, corrupt, and etc., play a role in given international organizations transferring their technologies to those societies. So therefore, this is a theory in terms of what determines the what we see as the diversion, so to speak, in regards to, we have on one side that there are economies that grow very well, and then there's economies that are disasters, so to speak, and they point to this the role of institutions in as it regards to the social infrastructure and subsequently the social capital within an institution and or society. So in the interest of time, I should say that I should be pointing out the facts of growth. There are 7 of them, but in the interest of time, I'll rather just not do that, but I'll just put it in as something that is necessary for someone to go through in their own time, to look at the role of growth theory, the role of economic institutions rather, or institutions in general, in relation to economic growth theory. Thank you.